Welcome to the first day of Super Festival, the Hand-Eye Society's annual indie games event where we celebrate the unique experiences and creators from across the indie game landscape from around the world. I'm Jordan Sparks, the Director of Technology at the Hand-Eye Society and your host for the Super Festival's Super Show, which we're running every day from today, November 25th, to Sunday, December 1st, with exciting talks by game developers from across the globe. In case you don't know, the Hand-Eye Society is one of, if not the oldest video game arts nonprofits in the world. You can find out more about us through our website at handeyesociety.com. We've been running Super Festival for a number of years now, and this year is very special because it has 4 parts, both online and this year also in person, making it a hybrid event. First, we have the Super Festival website, which you can access at bit.ly/HES-Superfest. Here you can find out all about this week-long event, the 30-plus games being featured, all the upcoming talks, and more. Definitely go check that out and discover more games. The second part is, of course, the Twitch show that you are watching, which will be every day from 6 to 9 p.m. Toronto time, aside from Sunday, which will be 1 p.m. to 6 p.m. Follow us to find out when we go live, and also check out the Super Festival website for more details on the schedule. The third part is the return of our legendary Torontron arcade machines. If you're in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, you can visit several venues in the city throughout the week to play some of the Super Festival featured games on location. Finally, there's the return of our famous Hand-Eye Society Ball, our fancy party for the Toronto game dev community, happening this Saturday, November 30th at 6 p.m. in Toronto. It's sure to be a fun time, but don't wait. Tickets are limited, and as of now, they're almost sold out. If you're in Toronto, be sure to grab a ticket and join us there. This is our 3rd annual Super Festival, and it is once again stacked with amazing talent. However, we wouldn't have been able to do it without all of our amazing sponsors. So thank you to Ontario Creates, the City of Toronto, the Province of Ontario, the Toronto Arts Council, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Canada Council for the Arts, as well as our studio sponsors Clever Endeavor and Stella Maris. Thank you so much for your support. Well, that's it from me. I'll be back later, but for now, let's get our game on and enjoy today's talks and games. Happy Super Festival, everyone!
Sage's skin breaks out with beads of sweat. They trail down her hairline. Her body tells her to be on high alert. Sage feels like a presence is eyeing her. Yet when she turns to look around, there's not another person in sight.
Oh my fucking god!
A trash can had fallen down.
Oh, calm down, Sage. It's nothing.
As Sage turns to the left, she glances at the prone form of what is actually a person. Before she can get a good look, something blurs past her and latches onto her right hand with a sickening crunch. Naomi injects Sage with the serum. A few seconds pass and nothing happens until...
Fuck! It burns! It burns, Naomi!
Fuck, what? What is happening? Naomi and Sage watch in horror as the creature eats away at what's left of Sage's hand and starts moving up her arm. Sage's flesh wriggles and drops to the floor.
You're on a path in the woods, and at the end of that path is a cabin. And in the basement of that cabin is a princess. You're here to slay her.
Wait, what?
If you don't, it will be the end of the world.
Now hold on a second. Don't you listen to him. What did I ever do to you?
She will do everything in her power to stop you.
Well, yeah. I don't want to die.
She'll charm and she'll lie and she'll promise you the world, and if she has the chance, she will kill you 12 times over.
Is he even listening to me?
Don't forget, the fate of the world rests on your shoulders.
You're not actually going to try and slay me or anything, right? Because I wouldn't if I were you.
If you try, I'll kill you as many times as it takes.
Hello, Superfest. My name is Seamus, and I'm here to talk narrative design. This talk is going to cover the basics of narrative design, writing for games, as well as tools and options you can use to implement narrative on a technical level. We'll also discuss how to manage the scope of your game's narrative, assuming that you're developing a small project on your own, or maybe for a jam with a very small team. This talk is going to be geared towards newcomers to the field, so I'm not going to cover any concepts that may be a bit more advanced, but for those of you who are more experienced, another look at the basics can never hurt. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. So, again, my name is Seamus, and my pronouns are he, him. I've been working in the industry as a freelancer for around 3 to 4 years, and I graduated with a bachelor in game design from Sheridan College. I specialize in programming and narrative design, which typically means I do a lot of technical narrative design, but I've done a lot of generalist work, and, being able to see the different parts of a project come together is something I actually really enjoy. Outside of games, my hobbies include drawing, consuming pretty much any kind of mystery fiction I can get my hands on, and I've gotten really into spreadsheets lately. Some games I've worked on include Validate Volume 1, which was a visual novel dating sim that I did some narrative programming on. I worked on Quest implementation on Cabernet, an upcoming narrative RPG where you play as a vampire, trying to navigate this new society she's become a part of. I've worked on Solid, a diverse 3D cyberpunk visual novel about fighting corruption and finding hope, and maybe even finding love. It had its 1-year anniversary just this past September, so you should check it out if you have the chance to. And then I have other non-commercial projects like Wish You Were Here, which I made for the Hand-Eye Society Superfest in 2022, I think, and that one was a lot of fun. That one's also a cozy little visual novel about friendship designed to resemble a chat client, like Discord. So lots of visual novels and narrative games. So before we jump into it properly, I wanted to set some expectations about what this talk is going to cover. As I said earlier, this isn't really going to be new for those who are already well acquainted with writing for games. This is going to be mostly informational, and we're going to go over a lot of stuff including definitions, how narrative elements are commonly used, and my hope is that by doing this, it'll give new devs an idea for how to start the process of planning out a game, because that could be daunting. So this advice is going to be fairly generalized. Everything I'll discuss is applicable to multiple genres and styles of games. There won't be advice specifically for writing for an action game, or writing for a horror game, or writing for a visual novel, and that kind of thing. I also won't be giving out writing advice, meaning I won't tell you how to write well-rounded characters, or give you tips on how to make the best use of a specific literary device, or the ways you could improve your writing overall. There are a lot of resources out there for writers who don't necessarily work in games to hone their craft, and I think those resources are going to be perfectly suitable for improving your writing in that way. And instead, I'm going to focus mainly on things that are essential to game narrative itself, things that are instrumental to stories within the medium of video games. That said, this also won't be a technical breakdown of any one software or program or narrative tool that you'd be able to use. Since you'll have the freedom to choose whichever engine you want to use, I can't really pin down just one thing to focus on because they all work differently, and there are quite a few options to choose from, which we will see later. And lastly, any advice I give out assumes that the project you're working on is going to be small. Either small personal projects, probably solo ones, or jam games are a good example, maybe with very, very small teams. Basically any games that you intend on running for no longer than an hour of playtime. So the suggestions in this talk may not be what I would suggest were the games larger or expected to be in a more polished state by the time the final build is completed. But with all that said, I'm happy to discuss anything that I didn't bring up today if there are any questions, and I'll gladly provide any advice and support to anyone who reaches out to me. My contact information will be at the end of the talk. So we're going to cover a bunch of topics today. Firstly, I'll give you a brief rundown of what a narrative designer is and what is typically expected of them on a team. I'll go over different types of game writing that frequently or exclusively appear in games or in the production of games, and how they can be used to evoke certain emotions in players, provide them with information, and motivate their actions. After that, I'm going to give you a big list of engines and tools you can use to implement narrative in your game, and I'll summarize some of their functions, what each one is good for, and show a few examples of the games made in each one. Towards the end, I want to cover expectations you should set for yourself in regards to developing your project, how to make sure you don't bite off more than you could chew, and how to keep your scope relatively manageable. And lastly, I'll leave you with a few suggestions on how to get started planning for your narrative integration. So what is the narrative designer? What exactly is it that they do? Well, I found this quote that I thought summed up the role pretty well in an article by Game Developer from 2011. It reads, "The core of this role is to champion story, craft compelling narrative elements, and define the systems through which they will be delivered to the player." The real answer is that the definition isn't quite as solidified as something like a programmer or a level designer might be. It really varies from team to team. Narrative designers are often lumped in with game writers. This is often the case when you have small teams, but on larger teams, there usually will be dedicated writers, and then the designers who will work with them, and other parts of the development team to integrate that writing. Narrative designers have this tricky responsibility to try and sculpt the various elements of the writing to fit within the game's systems. There's a lot of cross-team communication, which I'll mention in a moment. But then, there are also technical narrative designers. Those are the ones who will be creating, working on, iterating on, and or implementing the narrative on a programmatic level. They'll usually be working with departments like programming, audio, maybe animation depending on what mechanical needs there are for the systems they use. But in an oversimplification of the role, technical narrative designers put the words into the engine. When you're a narrative designer, you're running around communicating with a lot of other teams. This includes, but is not limited to, talks with producers, level designers, writers, artists, programmers. I forgot to include it, but audio is another big one if you have actors or people who need to be given guidance on the delivery of certain lines or specifications of assets according to the writing. For example, if you're working with a producer, they might have you creating and contributing to team-wide documentation that is specific to the narrative design. If you're working with level designers, you may be helping set the gameplay pace, layout notes for the environment, working with environmental storytelling, which involves the placement of certain assets. If you're working with artists, you may be providing these narrative sketches for environments and characters and any little detail that an artist could then use to go on to create a visualization of this concept. And the list just kind of goes on from there. Now let's go over what types of writing a narrative designer may be working with, or helping to write themselves. The type of writing you'll be doing will vary from project to project and genre to genre, but generally there is some overlap. This list is almost definitely missing more that I didn't think to include, but we'll be looking at dialogue, as well as choices, environmental storytelling, descriptions, and documentation, all of which have a lot of use within the medium of games. And in case it needs to be said, you don't have to include every single one of these in your game. As I said, most of these tend to overlap across games and genres, so you'll likely end up working on more than one of these types regardless of the scale of your project. Let's start with dialogue. Dialogue involves exchanges between characters and conversation directed at the player by NPCs. It is often used to showcase personalities, push the story forwards, or give information to the player or other members of the main cast. And these aren't just unique to dialogue, there are plenty of other ways to express and reveal these facets of a character. That said, not all dialogue needs to serve a higher purpose either. Sometimes you can just have your characters say something weird and a little out of pocket. And why not? I feel like a sentiment I see a lot in regards to writing is, if it doesn't make a big difference, if it doesn't really matter, if it doesn't push the story forwards, why is it there? But not everything needs to be a Chekhov's gun. You can certainly do that, but you shouldn't feel the need to have your dialogue only serve the overarching plot. It's incredibly useful for characterization, and exposition even, when it's used well. Both linear games and games with branching narratives may involve dialogue choices or some other action the player could take that will have a consequence. In linear games, choices can provide the illusion of choice and a sense of control for the player. The player may or may not realize the game is linear, but it might also make them happy that the game is stopping to ask for their opinion, even if it ultimately doesn't matter. Choices like this will eventually converge back into one main plot thread. Meanwhile, choices in branching games may permanently alter the setting and how the story progresses from that point forwards. Often, games like this also have different endings depending on the player's choices throughout the game. Oh, yes. So, throughout the presentation, I'll provide examples where I can. Unfortunately, I am very prone to hyperfixating on the games I really, really enjoy, so you're probably going to see a lot of repeated games here. But a fantastic game where you can use dialogue to affect an encounter and eventually an ending is Fallout New Vegas. Just for context, you confront this man and his forces in a battle to seize control of an important landmark in Nevada. His faction already controls a lot of land and has a lot of power, but due to the nature of expansion and of empire, which is what they're aspiring to, they realistically won't be able to hold this land forever. They can't dedicate the resources to hold it between all their other territories. And, using dialogue, you can convince him of this. It's a very tense conversation, and you can't just pick choices and hope something will work. You have to be smart and deliberate. And also, Obsidian was so real for this one, but there are many options for skills you can pick here. Skills that you would have been building up over the course of the game just based on how you would have wanted to build your character. There's your standard speech, which you can see right there, which is the more charismatic option. But there are also places where you can use skills like science or even barter in this sequence. It's super cool. Next, an example of linear narrative with choices comes from Final Fantasy XIV, which is an MMORPG. Everything is linear, but it's a great example of giving you a sense of control over your character's actions, because there's these little dialogue choices that are given to you throughout a big portion of the game. Particularly in the more recent expansions, when the story starts to focus on what your character is going through on a personal level, you have this opportunity to decide how your character, your Warrior of Light, would react to the events surrounding them. And that builds a stronger connection between you and your player character, who at times may just seem like a generic chosen one with no real personality as a player stand-in. Sometimes you have options that differ quite a bit from one another, but aside from characterization, they don't really affect much else. And other times you have silly meta options, like the one on screen right there. You know, we have fun here. And lastly, choices can be conditional. You can see it in the Fallout example, but some choices may be locked off to the player unless some criteria is met. In the case of a game like Baldur's Gate 3, you have dialogue options that could appear based on your character's species, background, class, or even what deity they might worship if they're a cleric. Again, this could just be flavorful in some cases, but you could also have conditionals such as checking if a player has enough money to buy an object from a merchant, or seeing if they have an item that maybe they could have picked up in an earlier section of the game that changes the outcome of the conversation they're having. When you're writing for games, you want to take into consideration what possible choices there are, what conditions need to be met for choices to appear, and what consequences may come as a result. Writers and narrative designers may also have to think about certain player actions and gameplay decisions, unrelated to dialogue entirely. I kind of put this here because I didn't know where else to put it, but for example, let's say there's a quest item in Act 1 of your game, and the player picks it up and keeps it until Act 3. Maybe it's a Book of Vile Darkness or that kind of thing. How does keeping this item affect the game from here on out? Will there be more quests relating to the item? Will it change something about your character going forwards? Does it affect your relationships? If your party is primarily made up of good aligned companions, will they get annoyed with you for keeping the Book of Vile Darkness? And on a more overarching scale, if keeping this Book of Vile Darkness causes one of your good aligned companions to exit the story, but you also needed them to get you from point A to point B, how is the game going to get you to point B now? To figure out this totality of consequences, the narrative designer has to work with the other disciplines on the team to figure out if it's even possible within the engine, within the systems that are established and that have yet to be built, to have these choices that lead to such a wide range of possibilities. Will you simply lock off that quest and make it inaccessible to the player now that they've lost the companion? Or will there be some other type of plot thread that they'd be able to encounter in Act 3 that will lead them down the same path? There's also a type of dialogue called dialogue barks. These are voice lines that play under specific circumstances or due to specific triggers. You've likely come across these before playing games. Common examples are characters announcing when they're reloading or getting shot in a first-person shooter, characters announcing the name of their abilities when they're using them in things like RPGs or MOBAs. Maybe characters have certain lines that will play when you're nearby or if you approach them. Or, if a game has crimes you get arrested for, a guard will react slightly differently to when they notice you doing certain crimes. They'll have lines for if they catch you stealing versus assaulting someone, for example. So what purpose do barks serve? Well, they provide feedback towards player actions, get their attention, maybe if something has changed in the environment. They can be used to convey information that can be crucial to the player's goals, or maybe they're just for fun. And it's good for characterization. Here, I have some lines that may play in Baldur's Gate 3 when your companion characters are sneaking around. Astarion and Shadowheart are two characters who prefer sticking to the shadows, albeit for different reasons, but they're a little cloak and dagger leaning, so this is comfortable for them. But then you have Gale, who is this dorky wizard that uses flashy magic, and Karlach, who is a big, excitable barbarian who's always ready to fight, and those two aren't feeling as up to it as their other party members. Gale's complaining about his knees hurting from sneaking, and Karlach is just too tall to look sneaky. And another great example of getting the player's attention and conveying information are callouts in Overwatch. Characters have different ways of calling out that they're using their ultimate ability depending on if they're on your team or if they're not on your team. If a match has two of the same character on opposing sides, knowing the difference is crucial because it could mean the difference between walking out into the open and getting exploded by D.Va's exploding mech, or taking advantage of people hiding from your team's D.Va's exploding mech. Next up, let's go over environmental storytelling. Environmental storytelling means using the player's surroundings to convey information, history, or provide characterization. The crux of it all is that it relies on player interpretation and invites multiple interpretations of its meaning. Typically, the true intent of why things are as they are may remain ambiguous or shrouded in mystery, so you never have the full picture. But that serves to create a sense of intrigue that gets players wanting to keep investigating. Inviting the player to uncover things for themselves and prompting them to interact with the world creates investment, as they're the ones gathering all these hints and clues to piece together the story that's being hinted at in the environment. I like comparing it to a good mystery novel, because that's basically what it is, where people will feel smarter and get excited if it turns out that their theories were correct, and, they were able to come to their own conclusions. And environmental storytelling typically aims to ask and answer 3 questions. Where am I? What is my relationship to this place? And what happened here? The question of where am I is a really simple place to start, and it either has a simple answer, or it's something that will prompt more questions that draw the player towards trying to find an answer. I'm going to use Hollow Knight as my example here. It's a sort of gothic, Souls-ish Metroidvania set in a land where infection has decimated the population. The area in the picture there is very much something the game points you towards, and as soon as you get there, it's super different from everything else you've seen up to that point, and you're like, oh, what's this? It gets you curious about what's past the gate, especially since up to this point you've found signs that the gate was closed for some mysterious reason. So then you ask, what is my relationship to this place? As they explore, the player should recognize something in their surroundings, and using information they already have, they might then be able to piece together the context of what's being shown to them. And answering the question doesn't always mean finding some literal historical connection between the environment and the player character. The player should just get the sense of, I'm supposed to be here, or I want to know more about this place. Once again in Hollow Knight, this fountain is found beyond the gates, decently far into the area. The figures depicted there should look familiar to the player at this point, or at least give off the sense that they're important somehow. So from there the player realizes they're moving in the right direction, or at least it may get them to keep investigating further to find the true meaning of this place. And the third question is, what happened here? Beyond their relationship to the area, environmental storytelling means prompting the player to ask their own questions to figure out what all these little hints being left behind mean. Questions like, why are these things here? Or, why aren't things here that I expected to be here? Discovery and deduction are how the player deals with things like threat assessment, and it reinforces certain things like potential threats. I don't have it pictured, but there's another moment in Hollow Knight where you come into a little sub-area that's lacking enemies and the tunnels gradually become narrower, so that's weird. What's going on? Eventually you're walking down a hallway and suddenly the way behind you gets sealed up, and by the time you realize you can't go back, it's too late. You're heading into a boss room. And that kind of sense of dread, the shift in tone as you realize you can't escape, is huge. Suddenly, everything clicks. All in all, your environmental storytelling should provide information that deepens the understanding of the setting or opens up new narrative threads to be explored. And to close off this part, here are some things you can think about when you're trying to apply environmental storytelling. Consider things like staging, where objects, poses, or environmental states might appear, the cause and effect of things scattered around the area, how do things turn out the way they are, and what are the hints of what the causes may have been. NPCs count as environmental storytelling. You can use them as part of your staging. A town with a lot of people walking around gives off a totally different vibe than one that's deserted. You could also use NPCs to showcase local culture and that sort of thing. As with all writing, you can incorporate foreshadowing, drawing connections between past and future story beats, Chekhov's gun and all that. If something is in a scene, it could very well come up later on and have some narrative purpose. And you can use objects like items and lore entries that the player could pick up. The visuals of these things can give off a particular vibe or aesthetic that's special to the area. For example, all of the documents in Hollow Knight are carved onto stone tablets. They used to use paper made from spider silk, but because their capital city is in a state of constant rain, the water would wash away the ink they use. It's a nice little bit of world building. Speaking of objects though, that leads us right into our next type of writing, descriptions. This one's pretty straightforward. Descriptions can be text or narration that provide insight into a subject's purpose or history. Descriptions can be found on or for things like items, locations, abilities, terminology, objectives, scenes, anything that may need elaboration. They typically serve to inform the player and, again, convey information that may be immediately relevant, but it can also serve to world build or maybe it's just there for fun, like an Easter egg. The example I have here is one from Final Fantasy XIV. This is just a chunk of rock salt. The description is pretty straightforwardly telling you what it is and what you use it for. It's a crafting material. But Final Fantasy is a big game, and there are a lot of reused items and things, which isn't bad or anything. But because of that, you don't want to just reintroduce the same item with a description that's the same thing but worded slightly differently. So, this special variant of rock salt instead features some lore. It's horrible lore, but it is very funny. Everyone gets to learn about the communal Ishgardian rock salt, so descriptions can be used for a bit of fun and humor as much as they can be used for integral information. Another example from Final Fantasy XIV I wanted to highlight is how it uses its quest journal. You have a journal of all your active quests, and they come with a little text blurb about what's been happening and then what your next objective is. Normally you'll have something like the top example, which is a very simple, Popanagu wants to test your skills, so he's arranged a test for you, which is very straightforward, and it gives you all the information you need. But in rare cases, you get something weird. The journal is usually written in second person, as though you were leaving notes from yourself to yourself. In one particular questline, however, the journal will update and take on a whole different tone. You still have your summary of events, but suddenly the writing starts to talk about you and refer to itself in the first person. So you start asking, who's talking to me? If you play the game, you may already start getting ideas about who it is, and that goes back towards the environmental storytelling and how tying things together and making players recall what they know gets them excited and invested. It's a clever use of an existing system, which also means no extra costs, and it shakes things up in a way that gets players excited. Like, once they realize that this could happen, they'll keep checking the journal, and now you have a new device to use in your storytelling. And lastly, narrative designers tend to maintain a lot of documentation. You'll be making things like story bibles, character biographies, histories and timelines for your setting, technical documentation of mechanics, writing down story beats. Basically, if it pertains to your narrative, you're going to want to write it down. Part of the importance of documentation is being able to refer back to it to maintain consistency, and to make sure that everyone has the same information. But it's also particularly important for working with other disciplines over the course of development. For example, if you have plans for environmental storytelling, you have to work with the level designers and that kind of thing. As a solo developer, I like maintaining documentation because it forces me to write things down, instead of just having nebulous story ideas floating around in my head. And these documents are almost certainly going to be living documents, which means you'll be updating and changing them over time. Alright, so that was a lot. But next up, we're going to cover some engines and tools you could use to make your game in, or to add narrative elements to your game. The process of building your game, again, will vary depending on what you're trying to do, but hopefully something from this list works for you. It's definitely not an exhaustive list. There are plenty of other options you could find just by searching through itch.io or any asset store for the engine you're using, assuming it has one. My curated list contains engines that are widely used or designed explicitly with telling stories in mind. In the interest of making sure these options are accessible, these are free tools that I've either heard of or had recommended to me, or that I've used myself. A majority of them are open source as well. Most are customizable via programming, but they'll come with useful features to start with. Either way, pretty much all of them are built to be approachable for people who don't know how to code. And once we've gone over the entire list, I will also mention how you can consider accessibility while making use of your chosen engine. First, we have some standalone options. There is one more that I didn't put on this slide, but I'll get to that near the end of this section. First up, we have Twine, which is probably one of the most widely used narrative tools. People outside of games who dabble in interactive fiction also use it for things like novels and poetry. It is probably by far the easiest one to pick up and start using. It features a node-based editor, which is good for prototyping and visualization. There are a bunch of story formats, which just alter the syntax and formatting of your text, and you can customize the styling and visuals using CSS and JavaScript if you're feeling spicy. I personally found it to be a really good way to get started in code. It is very easy to translate the writing you do here to other engines and systems, so, as I said, very good for prototyping, and because it's so popular, there are a ton of community resources out there. You can do a lot of funky styling things with Twine as well, like the game I have on top there. It looks like it's kind of styled like a mobile game, but all it is a picture sitting on top of a block of text, basically, but it evokes a really pleasing aesthetic. A lot of these engines are going to be flexible in that way. It's really going to come down to doing some thinking outside the box when it comes to getting around or taking advantage of the limitations of the engine you decide to use. Next up, there's RenPy. It's a very old engine, pretty much the visual novel engine to use. It comes with a lot of built-in functionality like saving and loading, skipping dialogue, autoplay, being able to go to a previous line, and all that. You are able to add extra stuff with Python. There are plugins out there by creators that allow you to add gameplay features, but there's no dedicated asset store. Most of the stuff you could find will likely be on itch.io or on creators' personal websites and blogs. But there is a ton of documentation, tutorials, and resources available, so it should be fairly easy to get into. Not too much else to say about this one, other than if you really want a solid open-source visual novel engine out of the box, and you're not really looking to write your own code for UI and gameplay features, this is probably your safest bet. Next we have Inky. It's entirely text-based and uses its own programming language made by Inkle Studios. One of the benefits is being able to preview the story directly in the editor without needing to export anything. You can customize your visuals with CSS, however you cannot add any extra functions or mechanics. What you can do, though, is integrate your writing from Inky directly into other engines. I'll go over some of that in a minute. But it's really easy to get into. You just download it, and you can use it right away. However, you can't do much to change the layout like you can for Twine. Generally, Inky games will always be vertically aligned like how you see in the previews there. If you want more freedom in making your game look the way you want, I would just use Twine. Last on the standalone list is something called Nerat. It was designed and inspired by Disco Elysium, which you might be able to see in the way the UI looks. It comes with built-in functionality for things like skills, quests, inventory, and some degree of navigation and or travel, which lends to it being used for RPG-like games. You can basically put buttons over the background, which could be a map or some other scene, and clicking on those buttons will trigger events. Events could be dialogue, a scene change, or anything like that, so it's very much built for a narrative game right out of the box. The visuals are customizable with CSS, like the others, however you can't add new functions. There are plugins out there for it somewhere, but it is a very new engine, so the resources aren't as mature or as reliable as they are for other engines. It also comes with a toggle for making the UI look more visual novel-like, with the text box across the bottom of the screen instead of on the side, so another option for visual novels as well. I personally have yet to use it, but I've taken a look at some of the demos and some of the documentation, and it seems solid. Definitely worth checking out if you're looking to make a narrative RPG, but you don't want to fiddle with making your own inventory or stats systems. So those were the standalone options. I also have some suggestions for plugins that could be used in more complex engines, though I'm only going to show off ones for Unity as that's the engine that I've used the most, and the one I'm most familiar with. Fungus is an older plugin. It can make visual novels right out the box. The UI and stuff is already in a good place for you to repurpose for whatever you need. There's no programming required as it's node-based and it uses visual scripting, though it may still be intimidating for a newcomer, just not as hard to get into. It does also use Lua for its features, which is strange personally because Unity uses C#, so adding new features might be a little awkward. My personal opinion is that Fungus is good for prototyping and not recommended for larger scale games. There's a lot of little quirks about it that make it less ideal than other solutions if you plan to make your game big eventually. Small games, however, are probably fine. A big downside, though, is that the documentation and links to tutorials and things are really outdated, so you'll find a lot of dead links on their website. There's a bit of confusion about whether or not Fungus is even still available, and it is, you just have to get it through Git now. It's no longer on the Unity Asset Store, which might turn people off because now there are extra steps to getting it into your project. All that might make it seem like I'm not recommending Fungus, but it's not a bad framework for a Unity-based visual novel at all. There are still some people who swear by it and who are working to maintain up-to-date guides on how to use it, so for beginners it's a perfectly fine way to get started. Next there's Yarn Spinner, my personal favorite. It was used in games like Night in the Woods, A Short Hike, and the games I have shown on the side there. The demo comes with a pre-made UI and a simple dialogue system, so you could import it to your project and immediately have that available to repurpose. One of the things I like about Yarn is that you can use basically any text editor for writing. The syntax is probably the easiest to learn out of all the options so far, and the formatting is very similar to Twine. There is a node view you could access, but only if you use Visual Studio Code to edit your scripts. But they do have an online version for you to preview scripts as well, called Try Yarn Spinner. The link should be on their website. The Yarn system can be tailored to your needs via C# programming. It's really customizable and flexible, and you can slot it right into your Unity project however you need, as long as you know how to code for it. But it's only a Unity thing for right now, so you can't take it into other engines yet. As far as I was able to find, the Unreal version is still in beta, and there is a Godot version in the works. I'll also add that they've started offering paid versions of Yarn Spinner that come with example projects. It's a little bit harder to find where to get the free version now just by googling, but you can find an installation guide in the documentation. I'm bringing up Ink again. As mentioned, Inky writing can be plugged right into other engines, Unity being one of them. There's support for more engines like Godot and Unreal as well, though I believe the Unreal version is a community effort rather than being supported by the developers themselves. Ink is very well documented. There's a lot of resources and tutorials out there for it. Like with Inky, you can view the story right in the editor, in this case the Unity editor, which is a plus for some people. You can edit the scripts either in Inky or VS Code. You can't change it in the Unity editor, and I'm not sure how the formatting interacts with other text editors, so it may just be those two. And like with Yarn, it's super flexible, and you can fit it into your game's existing systems. Unfortunately, the demo isn't as good for making visual novels right off the bat, but it's still perfectly usable for text-based games, and you could certainly make a visual novel using Inky. All it might take is some knowledge of the engine beforehand, or looking up resources and getting some help. So last but not least, this was the standalone I couldn't include in the first part because I think it deserved its own section. Bitsy and its various clones are another option for an engine. It's been popularly used for short and tiny narrative games and experiences over the last few years. There are hundreds of games over on itch.io at this point. Bitsy is, in its own words, a little editor for little games or worlds. The goal is to make it easy to make games where you can walk around and talk to people and be somewhere. Games can be saved out as an HTML file, and the game is played directly in your browser, and likewise you can import your file back into the editor to continue working on it. I believe Bitsy is a web page-based editor only. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a downloadable version of Bitsy on its own, but we'll put a pin in that for later. The graphics are extremely limited, usually taking up to 3 colors, and the player sprite is also very tiny. The mechanics are pretty much just walk around until you trigger something. The upside is that there's basically zero programming required. And the limitations are really interesting because it forces you to get creative. I've included images of some really cool looking games that I found that use Bitsy. The visuals for all of them are amazing for what little they have to work with. And Bitsy games don't need to be in that kind of top-down style that the tutorials show you either. People have made visual novels with it too. The engine is just designed for these intimate narrative experiences where you walk around and talk to people. Okay, and now we kind of go off the rails. There are so many Bitsy hacks out there that add to the engine and let you do more things with it. It's a little overwhelming, but fascinating. There's a hack where you could add JavaScript functionality to make your own new features. You could integrate Twine and Inky writing into the games with things like Twitsy or Binksy. The names are all great, by the way. And there are like a bunch more hacks that let you do things like add physics for platforming, more colors if 3 is too limited for you, create objects, have longer dialogue, include character portraits, and just so much more. Oh, and I said Bitsy is a browser-only editor. Yeah, someone made a downloadable version of it. And the thing is that the extra features don't make it feel any more or less Bitsy. The games are still small-scale and narrative-focused, and that's really charming. So check it out if you're not looking to do anything too crazy with your prototype, maybe. I haven't used it myself, but I went down a rabbit hole looking into it, and it looks super neat. Alright, so that was all the engines, and now I want to briefly go over accessibility considerations for your narrative game. Regardless of your engine of choice, you should be making sure your game is easy on the eyes, especially if it's going to be mostly text. Consider using basic serif or sans serif font faces. Don't use anything too decorative for your body text. Headers and name tags have a little more leeway, but you don't generally want to read paragraphs and paragraphs of text that's maybe a bit fancier than it needs to be. Consider using a dyslexia-friendly font face. Open Dyslexic is a big one. We could also opt for options like Comic Sans, Open Sans, Century Gothic, and plenty more that dyslexic people have vouched for. It's worth looking into. Also think about colors and contrast between the text and its backgrounds. Try not to do things like white text on a light background or anything like that. If your game has inline clickable text, are they obviously distinguishable from the rest of your text? Unless the options are meant to be hidden, be sure to check that they don't get lost. And not related to UI, but be sure to include content warnings where applicable. I'm sure most of you are aware of that, but just a little reminder to include that somewhere if your story includes potentially upsetting subject matter. We're almost at the end, and before that, I want to talk about scope and managing your scope for small projects. So all this is going to assume that you'll be working on a schedule, something like a jam deadline or otherwise self-imposed deadline. I recommend setting project deadlines for yourself even if you aren't under time constraints, because it's a good way to hold yourself and possibly your team accountable. Without deadlines, things may kind of just fall to the wayside and never get done. So creating things is always exciting, but try not to get ahead of yourself. It's really easy to get excited about the possibility of things, and there's a good chance you're going to end up with more ideas than you have the time to work on. Unfortunately, what that means is depending on what you want to showcase in your final build, narrative plans may have to be reduced or left out entirely. Ask yourself, is narrative an integral part to your core gameplay loop and mechanics? As an example, if you're making a platformer with some narrative elements, should you be prioritizing creating your dialogue system over the player's movement abilities or the level design? If your game doesn't need to lean on or towards the narrative, will that additional work be worth it, or even necessary in the end? A big thing I want to highlight is to beware scope creep. As you add to your game or work on your systems, more and more needs may reveal themselves over time, and that's going to push the goalpost for your minimum viable product. Changing even one thing in your narrative could cause a ripple effect throughout multiple departments. In this case, it can make more work for you as a solo developer. To give a personal example, I was part of a team a few years back that was working on a visual novel farming game. I was the technical narrative designer, but I also ended up taking over a portion of the management as people were getting busy or kind of falling behind on deliverables. The gameplay and narrative systems were ready to go basically within the first weeks of development, and the writing was pretty much the last thing that needed to get put in, plus stuff we could only do after the writing was done. So the writers gave an outline and character ideas to the rest of the team, and we kind of had to work ahead of them. The artist made a batch of sprites for every character with generic expressions, and those ones pretty much were able to cover everything. We implemented the first draft versions of the writing, which is what we were using for a few months, but then the writers suddenly came back to us with edits that made the scripts almost twice as long as their first drafts, and there were requests for new expressions and features, and things got messy. All of a sudden, we were a few weeks out from submission deadline, and now we had a huge new section of the game to test, new character art that needed to be made, and we only had one artist at the time, and we dodged making a new feature to allow 3 characters to be on screen at once, but we had to explain to the writers that it just wasn't going to happen. And at that point, we were still missing some of the scripts for characters, and the editing wasn't completed until the very last second. Obviously, doubling the size of your script is going to cause problems, but even something small like writing a line for a character where they now require a new expression makes additional artwork, and now you have to consider how doing that will impact your timelines elsewhere. So if things have to be cut for any reason, narrative or otherwise, that's okay. And for small projects, there's no shame in using placeholders either. At the time of writing, I had just played the Sea of Stars demo over the summer, and the demo would have moments where you talk to characters and the text would be like, "This is a placeholder," or something like that. There will always be time to refine your project into something better later. It's better to save your energy and ideas for when you can give them the proper time and dedication they deserve. Really take into consideration the time you have and try to plan accordingly. To give you some recommendations on how to determine if narrative fits your scope, try to ask yourself, how impactful do you want your narrative to be? What is the least amount of story needed to get the player started, or what is the most important part of the story to convey to the player? And by that I mean, what's going to give people the best idea of what your game will be about? What's something that sets the tone well, or introduces the world and its concepts well? Tutorials are a good way to kind of get the best of both worlds in terms of introducing mechanics and narrative. How are you going to present your narrative elements? To help with that, you can make a rough plan for your narrative systems and mechanics you may need. How much work is going to be required to create them? If your game is entirely interactive/narrative fiction, you may want to use an engine that comes with most, if not everything, you already need. Most engines are more powerful than you'd think, and require little programming experience, if any, and there's a lot you can do with very little, so take that into account as well. Okay, so I've been talking a lot. We've covered a lot today, and I want to try to summarize the parts you'll be thinking about when you get started on planning your narrative game. First and foremost, ask yourself if you need to include the narrative at all. If your game is pitched as something that's more gameplay heavy, the answer might be no. If that's the case, you don't have to think about implementing narrative. But if you are making a narrative game, how much narrative are you going to include? Pick the most important parts to form your base. Keep it simple to start with, and you could add onto the base if it turns out you either need more or have the capacity to keep more. This also goes for technical considerations like mechanics and other gameplay systems, but for right now, only include the parts you 100% want to have in. Start your drafts early. Start on a living draft of at least a few of these items. Figure out your general story arc, if there is one. Figure out what your goals are in terms of what you want the player to experience playing your game. You don't have to do this, but a starting point may be to pick a tone and or emotion you want to stir in the player. And then, draft out what you want to be included in your prototype. It's basically step 2, but now I'm telling you to remember to put it down on paper. And then, think about how you're going to present your story, what elements are going to be needed in terms of characters, environments, systems, and all that. Lastly, figure out your technical needs. Now that you know how much story you're going to have, and potentially even have an outline of what will be included, roughly plan out the systems and mechanics that will need to be developed. And I do mean roughly. You don't need pages and pages of technical considerations, more along the lines of like, if your character can earn money and spend money, how are you going to keep track of that money? If there's an engine that comes with those mechanics or decent stand-ins for those mechanics built in, maybe you can use it for your first draft. And if you decide to make your own system and mechanics, just be aware of how much extra work that's going to make as well. Maybe there are plugins and tools available that will do the things you're trying to do. And we've made it to the end. Narrative design is one of those disciplines that can be defined differently depending on who you're talking to, but on a whole, I hope I've managed to provide a decent starting point for anyone who's looking to get into making and crafting narratives for games. It's something that I'm passionate about, even if it's not what I get to do very often in my career, and so remembering these basics as I work on my own solo or jam projects is important to me. Thank you very much for listening, and feel free to connect with me on any of the socials that are on screen right now. Have a great rest of your Superfest.
Inside every creator lies a guiding star, a unique vision waiting to illuminate the world. At Stella Maris, we're not just a partner, we're your compass. With tailored mentorship, essential tools, and unwavering support, we nurture your brilliance. Discover your path, unleash your creativity, and let your star shine brightly.
In this corner, Punch Facer. And in this corner, Tim.
And it's over! Sorry, folks, but the only rule is kill here at Blood Dome 99! Use this gun! Use more guns! Use whatever this is! Use guns to shoot the infinite ineffable mystery of our own spiral galaxy! Earn more money so you can spend more money on more upgrades, or weapons, or arenas, or Tenable Dog! But don't spend too much! You still have to buy your freedom! Enter the Blood Dome, choose your weapon, and fight to escape the future of 1999! Available now in early access. The big gun. What's she gonna? Yeah. What's she gonna do? The big gun. What's she gonna? Yeah. What's she gonna do? The big gun. Where's she gonna? Yeah. Where's she gonna go? The big gun. Where's she gonna? Where's she gonna go? Allie's mom is in trouble with a really bad guy. Ricky's gotta have his money and her purse was dry. So Allie's taking grift lessons from a guy named Ted. And she's skipping out of bed camp. Adventure instead. So get ready for adventure and see Allie pull off. The big gun. Give me money. Yeah. Give me my bag. The big gun. Give me money. Yeah. Give me my bag. Step one, Allie test those skills. Big marketing is tricky, but she gotta get those bills. If Ted thinks she can handle it, I'll bring her along. She's got a job in Las Vegas. And what could go wrong? So get ready for adventure and see Allie pull off. Talking, sneaking, hustling away to the end. Allie's got what it takes. Faking, disguising, joking, across the country with Ted. Till he raises the stakes, till he raises the stakes. Hop a train, cause you won't go the long. Hit the cash to save the video store. Find a payphone, checking on your mom. Hit the cash to save the video store. Hit the cash to save the video store. Hit the cash, save the video store. So get ready for adventure and see Allie pull off. The big gun. The big gun. A new world, a new home, a new family. Adventure beyond the safety of your home and confront what lies in waiting. Defend your flock from the perils of this world, but don't be late. For dinner, forage, fish, and farm to stock your pantry. Improve your home and tend to your flock, but look out for Shub. He takes quick to a love potion. Guide your flock through this world, for you are not alone. You shall... Hush, please, I'm doing something. You shall... What do you want? Oh, you want to say it together? Well, all right. You shall not pass.
Inside every creator lies a guiding star, a unique vision waiting to illuminate the world. At Stella Maris, we're not just a partner, we're your compass. With tailored mentorship, essential tools, and unwavering support, we nurture your brilliance. Discover your path, unleash your creativity, and let your star shine brightly.
Hello, everybody. How is everybody doing? Well, guess what? We are actually live right now. Hope everybody is having a wonderful Super Festival and are enjoying the talks so far. Hope everybody's enjoying everything going on in Super Festival. Make sure you check out the website. Make sure you check out all the talks this week that are happening, and that you're also making plans if you're in Toronto to go to the Trontrons and the ball. So, games cover a wide spectrum of stories and content, and the use of narrative has always been a powerful way to get us all engaged. It can get us in situations we have never imagined. It can help us get into the mindset of being adventurers and slaying that dragon. It can help us see the world through a different light. And narrative is a key part of game development that is a sentiment that is shared by our first live talk of Super Festival. So, here to talk about narrative arts, failing the fun, please give a warm Hand-Eye Society welcome to Evgeni Puzankov, and he's going to talk next. Take it away, Evgeni.
Hello. Thank you for joining in to my talk about narrative arts and how fun it is to fail the fun. I am indeed Evgeni Puzankov. You can also find me as Zhenya Puzankov. It is not a nickname, just my name, Russian thing. But you also can look for me as All Worms, whether underscore or not, at everywhere except for Twitter. Also, I do apologize. Altitude sickness was not on my bingo list of things that can go wrong, but I will probably be short out of breath a couple of times during the talk. Also, I would like to apologize to any narrative designer. There is a lot of narrative talks. If I step on somebody's toes, this was not my intention. We don't know what we're going to talk about. But yeah, first I will introduce myself a little bit more and give you a little bit of overview of what I have been doing and my perspective. I started in 2010, in November actually, working at Artagon Games on hidden object puzzle adventures before they went free to play, so with a focus on narrative. Treasure Seekers was actually the first game that I have wrote a single line for, and Depths of Betrayal was almost completely me. I have also worked on slasher MMO for children. Don't worry about the link disappearing behind my head. It's long defunct. I worked on some mobile games and Facebook games. I worked as a producer in an outsourced company called Cygnus Labs. Again, doesn't exist anymore. And one of my first proper narrative design jobs, and the last job I had in an office, was at Suricat Games. Again, doesn't exist anymore. It has a different name now. Where I worked on that story-driven CCG Panoptis and on a little plug-incorporated clone, Pocket Cult. I also worked on a rhythm game called Paper Knight, and after that, it's all freelance. Starting with I'm just giving this is selected titles. Starting with The Long Reach, for which we were nominated for a bunch of awards. It's a pretty good game. Also, majority of the team is Ukrainian, so give them a little help. We also worked with Wooden Monkeys on a game called Save Koch. This was the first game for Wooden Monkeys, and again, got nominated for some awards. I also worked on VR games like Captain Toonhead. At some point, 8-9 years into my career, I had a breakdown and I decided that I need to get some education in video games. And so I went to Köln Game Lab in Germany, where I was working on a master thesis of absurd games. I will touch on that also a little bit later. But something has happened that led me on the route of solo game making. It started with a weird adaptation of Howl by Allen Ginsberg called 30 Howl, and mostly is just a shader fest, but it is dear to me and it is a start of something strange. I'm also weirdly known for a game called Baby Labor. I will talk about it more. It is part of the presentation. While working on making games alone, I still kept doing narrative design, notably with Wooden Monkeys, with whom we have continued to work, with Song of Farka, which received Best Storytelling and Best Narrative Awards at NYX Game Awards. And I have been working on some strange stuff, which will be the subject of the presentation, such as Duck Date, a game about dating a duck who doesn't say vowels. And the last project and the biggest project that I have made was released this May. It's called Ahanar. It is an anti-war political video game, and the road towards it is partly part of the presentation. I'm also teaching narrative design. I started at Narratorica, which we no longer work together. It's all amicable. I'm now teaching it on my own completely, independently. There is a course open right now, but I'm not going to dwell on this slide. I'm also a curator and a researcher at Briefs, which is a Gold Extra initiative. It's a little microfund where we are each year, based on an open call, we give selected game developers 1,500 euros to make a game, and we recommend spending no more than 40 hours to make it. And we contractually obligate people to do the first release completely for free on each. I do recommend going after that link and subscribing to the newsletter, because maybe we will give you money next year. We are doing this every year. And right now, I am also a PhD student at York University, which is what brought me to Toronto, with my subject being formal dissent in interactive media, and formal and political, and you will see why in a second. So, to the talk proper. The impetus of this approach that I have comes from this line, honestly. This is from Grant Howitt from his podcast Happy Dice Friends. I couldn't find the exact episode. There are 150 where it is mentioned. Basically, the line goes something like this: to criticize X, you gotta make X fun. And I'm assuming to everybody who is watching or listening, this is absolutely makes total sense. This is absolutely normal for our game industry. And obviously, there are no problems with this. This is the medium we are working on. This is the tradition. Unless around 2 days after you have left your home in St. Petersburg because your country has invaded another country and you want to do something about it, and you decide to pitch an Austrian fund a video game about a bomber flying over a country that is totally not Ukraine, except it is, that criticizes bombing people. So to criticize X, I gotta make it fun. And I hope you are starting to see a problem with the previous statement and with specifically with the word fun here, because I'm left with only two choices. Because our industry is basically, this is, if it isn't fun, trash it, is a common narrative for everybody who is talking about how to make video games. If your prototype isn't fun, change it. If your feature isn't fun, trash it. Scrap whatever isn't fun. So I'm left with two choices. I can not make the game, so not criticize it, or I can risk making people enjoy it. And with this game specifically, I do not want to run this risk. This is not the point of the game. This is, to me, it's abhorrent and unethical to make something that can risk making people enjoy bombing people. Or I can just make a game wrong. And that, to me, is what narrative arts became. It's, in a simple TLDR way, narrative arts is just games done wrong. Because approaching it from narrative design first is a wrong way in the traditional game development. But of course, I want to emphasize, bad game is not equal a game done wrong, no matter what the comments say, no matter what gamers say. We're not trying to make a game bad. We're just taking a different process and for a different goal. So how, though? I only have my tool set. My main tool set is narrative design. And nobody ever said about narrative and for narrative design that it needs to be fun. We're supposed to support people who are making things fun. And so I just took narrative design and I approached the game with it. So for the targeting mechanic in this game, the input registers, but doesn't matter. So when it doesn't matter when you press space or whether it's on the red slide or not. It's just imitating the mini game that I actually took from OnlyCan's game, and that's it. It doesn't matter when you press space; the game is going to progress. The game progresses even if you don't do anything. The final result, so in this specific situation, is casualties number. Is completely randomized, and it's always going to be bad. And the result, so like the actual bombs being dropped, is mostly not shown unless I want the player to be upset, devastated, or terrified. So basically, what led me to my current approach is that, like, if narrative should support game design, if I'm not game designer and I'm a solo game developer, on this game, that means that narrative design can work. I fully disagree with kind of the traditional thing of like, oh, if you make a video game, then you are graduating to the game design. I'm a narrative designer first. If somebody says to me that I'm a game designer because I made games, I'm going to correct them. I will take Game Maker, but my job is narrative design, and this is what I'm doing. And so that came to the standalone practices. However, there are a lot of things that are stopping us. And for the narrative design here specifically, my goals, I feel like, were delivered. My goal was to critique ability to hit only military targets, precision bombing, so to speak. Critique competence of military, which suddenly appeared in Russia around 2021, 2022. It never happened before, even with my parents. The goal of targeting minigame is to experience futility, is to experience frustration, the feeling that you can't get it right. You're never supposed to get it right. Otherwise, the point of the game is destroyed. None of them are fun. But however, they are using some game design tools, but they are using them from narrative design perspective. And most of it takes approach from narrative first and narrative as a standalone. Games done wrong is not completely discarding game design. It's just using the same tools for different process with different goals. The same way that a lot of game designers use narrative design. Like there is no narrative designer on board, but they are experiences and they are narratives that have been designed, whether they agree with them or not. Nuclear Throne is a wonderful critique of the American dream as an American pipe dream, but there was no narrative designer present, but narrative design still happened. It's an experience. We will recognize it. It doesn't mean that we can't do it in the opposite direction. There is a disclaimer, though, and I will be addressing those points, that Bomber Looks Down is a short game. It's a linear game. There are 2 endings. However, nobody has, and thankfully, nobody has ever gotten to the second ending. Second ending was supposed to trap people who have drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak. It was also commissioned and paid in advance. And it takes around 15 minutes to complete, which at this point, I'm feeling like for a lot of you, it completely discredits everything that I have said previously, because it's a short game. It's a linear game. You can't sell it. But I am going to talk about it a bit more. I would say that I decided not to include a lot of stuff that is featured in my actual thesis on absurd games, because those are more into. But for starters, it's outdated. It predates Bomber Looks Down by about a year or two. Not outdated, but there is more that I want to focus on in this specific talk. But if you feel like it, give it a read. It's on itch. It's free. What I want to talk is game making traditions, because my goal in this talk is more to open your design spaces, so to speak, which will is like if the games can't be fun, what else they can't be. I also am using the word traditions here explicitly. I do apologize for anybody who has a different connotation with the word. I am Russian, and traditions in my culture for a millennium were used to oppress our own people. So to me, it's not a bad word, not a good word. To me, it's more like a thought terminating cliche, which is an actual term mostly used for cult leader speak, where you want to reduce disagreement. These are like lines such as "It is what it is. God works in mysterious ways. Agree to disagree," and bringing it back to the games. This is just how games are made. And the one I abhor the most is X doesn't sell. Somewhere around 2012 to, I want to say 2016, whenever you pitched a space game, just a game that takes place in space, you would immediately see the response, well, space doesn't sell. And that's it. That was the whole explanation for why this space game cannot be made. Then, of course, we know now, like Starfield exists. No Man's Sky exists. No Man's Sky is also good now, apparently. Star Citizen, does it exist or not is irrelevant. It earned a lot of money. And this was completely, absolutely irrelevant phrase, which after like 15 years of game development, it's basically Russian paranoia just basically kicked in, and I started questioning more and more of those. So in this talk, I'm going to go over these traditions and trying to, liberate you a little bit from them. That would allow you to sort of fail it safely and fail the fun with purpose. And I give an example of the traditions. Ludonarrative relationship, you must, and I hear the groaning, let me cook. Almost everybody in the narrative design environment have heard about ludonarrative dissonance. I'm not going to use the term dissonance for the whole thing because this is reductive. But if you are not aware with this concept, is basically ludonarrative dissonance is thy narrative should match the mechanic. If it doesn't, it's dissonance, it's bad, you should avoid it. You're not supposed to strive for anything, just avoid it. It's a boogeyman. And usual example is, at least was, Uncharted, where you are playing archaeologist Indiana Jones fantasy, and you have ranked an immense kill count, and you're not in prison, you are a good guy, something is wrong here. However, this is not a dissonance. If we explore this topic a little bit more, for starters, like considering if there is a dissonance, maybe there is a resonance, and also, is it actually a dissonance? If we explore it more, and I love this extreme design spaces exercise, where you just try to find what is the absolute extreme version of in one direction and in another side of direction. Another example I really use is loops. What is the perfect loop? What is just a loop? What is absolutely not a loop? And both of them can't exist, of course, but it isn't relevant. It just opens the design space and tells you, is this the exactly narrow environment that I'm working in, and is it correct? So for ludonarrative dissonance and relationship, there is resonance, there is dissonance, and there is a point in the middle that is traditional ludonarrative dissonance, which is Uncharted. So resonance is absolutely a perfect match, right? This is a good thing to strive for. This term, basically, as far as I know, nobody except me ever uttered. The dissonance would be completely opposite. And the traditional one is honestly just a game. Like this term with the game designers, it was mostly with the conversation with the game designers, the defense of it, of like putting the balance a little bit of the ludic side, was always just, this is just how games are. And after years of it, I would agree. Like the things that create this traditional dissonance are basically performative utterances of video games. Like, yeah, video games, our main verb right now is shoot, kill. It's violence. It's a lot of it is just, yeah, it's games. We just put them in there. That's what it is. So like calling them dissonance is like reductive and irrelevant. Also, like it's a boogeyman that you like. My issue with the word looking to dissonance is mostly just because it tells you what not to do. It doesn't tell you what to strive for, which is way more constructive. But this is one thing that is like being basically spooked. Every narrative designer is being spooked by. But to further illustrate, like the resonance would be in a simpler way, like if applied to say shooting mechanic, you shoot things and they die. The dissonance would be you shoot things and somehow they heal. And I don't mean as a medic at Team Fortress, although this gif is hilarious. I mean like it's just literally it's a gun, you kill people and then there is a line, you just healed somebody. You are playing a medic. Like that would be the dissonance, and that can be used. Juxtaposition is an extremely powerful concept, but it leaves a lot of people confused. And I'm going to leave why that's not a bad thing. And another tradition in this same way, and the utterance basically, is that games must sell. And this is the point where I would like to say that everything that I'm saying right now is not about AAA, it's not about AA, it's not about A, it's not just about indie game, it's about indie games too. It's about almost the entirety of the traditional video game development. Well, no matter what we talk, games must sell. This is our way to pay rent. If a game doesn't sell well, the studio goes under, people are getting fired, and everything. And we have only infrastructure and forced to sell games. And this is our only all sort of reliable way to keep making video games and keep existing in this space. Except, no, we don't. And the industry is on fire, and people are getting fired everywhere. And which are specifically games that sell, and what does it do? This might not necessarily be an answer anymore, especially if you're going in an art situation. The anti-war video game is never going to sell. This is not an option. So what can it be doing? And I am going to help you out here. I'm just going to cover with my face completely the word sell and just try, as an exercise, just try to consider what game can, what's the game purpose can be other than to sell it. And making a game fun is fundamental to selling the game. And that affects a lot of our design spaces. And this is something that prohibits us from using narrative design to the full ability. It's what hamstrings us a lot. Out of these games, except with a brief exception, I will address it separately. Ahanar was paid for by Goethe Institute. It was part of their closed call. I have received a grant of 5,000 euros to develop it. Bomber Looks Down, I believe, was 3,000 euros, commissioned by Gold Extra to be presented as part of the Fifth Commandment series at Stenda Salzburg. And Duck Date, the game where there are no vowels, was made as a pilot for briefs. We just wanted to check, can you actually make a game in 40 hours? Because we didn't know. Maybe this was completely unreasonable. And all the games that are made for Briefs Microfund, like I said, there are no strings attached, except it has to be sold for free, at least on itch.io, at least in our bundle. Apart from that, it doesn't matter. And this creates a completely different design space. I can tell from the perspective, it is different. And I recommend you checking out the games that were created by Briefs, by other developers. I recommend you checking out the best wine game ever made, Death to Venus. I recommend checking Fantastic Annihilation, which is the only clicker in existence that can and is supposed to be finished. There's also Fantastic Game Mondays from our Absurd series. And again, if you're thinking like this is some obscure stuff that why would we care about? Mossalina, one of the more celebrated games, has started as in the Absurd series, our first series from the first year. And I do recommend you to go to Gold Extra Briefs. That would be Googleable and will send you to the right place and checking out those games and what can be done if the money is taken out of the equation. I will also even not commissioned, there are certain surprises that can happen. Baby Labor is effectively a shitpost. Baby Labor was made in 12 hours. Baby Labor earned me so far around $1,100 United States. It was featured in Indiepocalypse, which is a monthly anthology by Pizza Pranks. I do, if you have a small game and something creative and weird, 100% seek Indiepocalypse. Pizza Pranks pays for it. And also just play their games and support Indiepocalypse, because there should be more weird, strange games. Baby Labor was also in a bundle, Shorty Games with Worse Graphics, and in general, somehow, $1,100 for 12 hours of work is very good. And it was made basically just as a joke. Its purpose was to make my friends laugh, and somehow it ended up earning me a lot of money, considerably. I would $1,200 on its own is not a lot of money, but divided by 12, and suddenly that's a decent hourly rate. It's almost $100 per hour. So when you're forgetting and when you're removing the necessity to sell games, you're more open to experimentation, because there is a huge risk in releasing a game that has experiments, especially in the narrative design area where nothing is reliable. You're less scared of gamers. And I don't mean gamers TM using the James Stephanie Sterling taxonomy. I mean just people who just are gamers, who play video games. It's extremely more fun to make. It has vibes of working in the R&D department, which I feel are even more rarer nowadays. But even mobile games at some point, hyper casual has the vibe of it, just research and development, seeing what works, seeing what not works. And of course, refunds and length are irrelevant. And that is important, because you're not worried about it. You're just making something that has a goal other than to be sold, other than to be fun. For example, can you imagine a commercial game where the main character with whom you are talking for about half an hour, I believe that's how long Dark Date takes, somebody just isn't saying vowels? I know that you would be mentioning Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines with the Malkavian text and Malkavian font specifically. You could also mention some of my own games where I'm using the Helvetica HELL font, and some others, and some other screwery with fonts. But just removing every single vowel, that's weird. But for me, this was the experiment. This was the specific purpose which I wanted to try. Basically, can you and who can read this? Who can read text if you just remove all vowels from the English language? I thought it would be split between native speakers and non-native speakers, but it just split between population entirely, just half and half, which was an interesting observation. And also it created a very specific character with a very specific attention just because of it. At some points in the narrative, she does actually speak with vowels, and that becomes a point, and that becomes a beat of the narrative, and that creates an emotional effect. It is a bad idea if you use it traditionally and if you apply game design, because half of the time, until you figure out what she's saying, you cannot understand her. But the game is looped. You see the same phrases a lot of times, and eventually you just do. Another tradition is that games should be long. And as if you have noticed, most of the games that I have developed solo are short. Ahana is the longest one, and it takes about an hour. Yes, I have hidden the G on purpose. Please don't be confused. And games being long is a problem. Try thinking, what does it feel to make a good game? Again, we're removing the fun aspect from it, or we even including it, that is, say, an hour long. We haven't made games on purpose that are an hour long as an industry for a long, long time. Is it the difference of what we can try and do story-wise, like short stories versus novels? If you are writing a short story, you can afford, for example, making a character study. You can't, occasionally you can develop it more into a full novel that has started as a character study, but you cannot do that. The stories have less time to be developed, so you are doing something different. There's also less padding for runtime, because making a short game and selling it on Steam is a scary thing. It can be refunded, or you can have what I believe is the tradition is 1 hour per dollar or something like that. which is ridiculous, of course. It doesn't address the quality at all, just the amount of time elapsed. You also don't need to use reminders. If you have ever worked on mobile games as the extreme version of it, there might be a delay not just of hours between story beats. It might be delay of 5 days. It might be delay of years. And you have to remind something where basically you're wasting time on some content that doesn't necessarily needs to be here. That doesn't, well, should, like, you can do it other ways, especially if you're doing a short game. Everything, like the memory span can last for half an hour or an hour. There's also a problem, but if, like, I'm going to use not mobile games, but like even if we are talking about a game that's 10 hours long, it can be played, say, 2 hours, 2 hours, 2 hours over the weekday. You still have to remind people of something that has happened 24 hours before. There's also less content, which makes it less expensive, which means making a game for $1,000, for $2,000, way more feasible. It earns its money back, especially if you have been paid for, because you have been paid for. And it allows for more games that are also accessible. It's unrestricted pacing, which allows, again, more experimentation and more testing. What happens if you pace more? What happens if you are playing with intensity? What happens if you're playing with agency as a part of the pacing element? It opens more problems and more good problems for narrative design that make you a better developer and also make the games that you're making better. For instance, endings. When you're making a short story, the players are going to get to the ending. And this has broke me considerably because I didn't know how to make endings except make it satisfying. The games are long. And of course, like, I'm not talking only about my games or games we have sponsored for briefs. There is a Critical Darling 30 Flights of Loving, which I believe takes about half an hour, which also allows to cut content that is not necessary and create this amazing, like, just breakneck narrative with pacing and with montage and editing that creates a fantastic and one-of-a-kind story just because it's short. And also Paratopic, one of my most favorite games. Also, I could add here PT, that is just the demo that has completely obliterated everybody. Also, just completely irrelevant but tangential, because I remembered it only like a minute before the stream. Paratopic and Cyberpunk 2077 are the only two games, as far as I know, where you can have a dialogue with a character, with an NPC, and also walk around. And once you see it and realize that this is not that difficult, especially if you have considered other things that I'm going to mention, then it's going to blow your mind. But like doing a dialogue and still walking around, again, opens you to more and more possibilities. What can you see in other cameras? But again, it's only two games. How did that happen? Because experimentation is just not relevant. Also, another thing is, and this might be terrible and controversial take, but gamers must be appeased. And here are some reasons and why exactly I'm using the word appeased. Because gamers have, and by gamers again, I don't mean gamers trademark. I mean just people who regularly play video games. Gamers have time. I'm pretty sure, like, for a lot of people who are about my age, who have a job, who have to do, you have like had the same problems. Like, you want to play a video game, but it takes 50 hours to finish it. Gamers can also justify the price. I do recommend, and although like it sounds obvious in hindsight, but try to approach to like several different of your friends and ask them what will they do if they have extra $20. None of them would say video games, including gamers, honestly. But if you say, why don't you buy a game? The gamers are the only ones who would have a different approach. And especially if we're considering that most games are developed to be fun for people who are not gamers, I'm going to use the word players here. It's going to be like something else where they can reach other reliable fun. Because again, we make games for gamers. Gamers are easier to develop for. They know they have high level of media literacy. You have less things to explain. You can make more complex things, as in you can innovate in game design, because there we can innovate. But it also means that it's way less accessible to other people. Try thinking of how many things you need to teach a person who have never played a third-person shooter how to play Last of Us 2. And everybody is saying that Last of Us 2 is like, or Last of Us First is is one of the better stories that has existed. But it's inaccessible as hell. Moreover, while I'm on Last of Us, I think about how you would adapt the most famous episode of the TV adaptation, the one about Doom's Prepper and the person they found. It's a beautiful episode. It's a beautiful story. I was completely broken when I realized that in the game it's just notes. And try to think how you would create that game. And if you're thinking something like Stardew Valley, do please think about it a little bit more. I do recommend thinking that Life is Strange, for example, or that Telltale exists, or maybe a visual novel or something like that. This also creates less variety because we have been developing games for exactly one demographic. I'm not going to there is obviously a variety in this demographic. There is obviously different genres, but we're not creating other things because we are making basically we have co-evolved the symbiosis with them, and we have to appeal to them so that they can buy games and so that game developers can survive. This also ensures that there is an effort-based endings because there's a lot of time to be spent on, a lot of money to be spent on, and it would be mean to say punish them for, say, I don't know, destroying an ecosystem because you need an extra wallet to hold your arrows. It also demands mandatory power fantasy because it has to be fun, it has to be replayable, it has to be infinite. All of those are quite extreme restrictions on the design space that we have. These are things that, in some ways, because we cannot do different endings, we cannot do different things other than power fantasy. And it also makes it genuinely inaccessible to some players. And in this case specifically, I do mean inaccessible to players as in whoever plays your game. But I have to say that accessibility is genuinely in a traditional way of game accessibility, like color blindness, what you have thought first, is absolutely important and supersedes any design requirements. We're supposed to, if we have an ability, we're supposed to provide for it. And I know that I have made a game where there are no single vowels, and any people with dyslexia will hate Helvetica. But that's the purpose of the game in some ways. I would also mention here that the answer to that might be to go to the festival and to play a short version of a game. But also we are so looped to how we are making video games, including the interfaces, that even Nathalie Lawhead would still present it as a keyboard and mouse. But think about a normal player and think about the stuff that they don't know how to approach it. They don't necessarily know that WSAD is the way to move around, or that maybe arrows are working. Have you introduced arrows? How gamepad works specifically? What is the notation for the buttons? Does the mouse work? Because I do remind you that at some point we didn't develop things for mouses. We had to invent this stuff. And it's really painful when you're showcasing a game and somebody doesn't know how to look up. And it is important for this presentation part. Because if you're making something political, artsy, you're making something that is not necessarily fun, you are removing gamers as your audiences. This is why this tradition is terrible. And this, despite the fact that it dictates how we are making games, because the target audience might just be outside of it, but we do not know how to make interactive experiences for them. As an industry in general, I'm struggling with it all the time. This is the subject on which I have the most problems. How do I present the game to people that doesn't look like you are playing a game, even though it is a game, it's an interactive experience? Do I name it something different? What would be the different infrastructure? How much, what controllers I'm using? Of course, there are some inspirations here, like Line Wobbler, for example, which is an extremely accessible game, and I do recommend watching videos about it. If you don't know, Line Wobbler is basically those LED strips. This is the game. It's a one-dimensional game where you're going around LED strip, and the controller is just moving left or right. For narrative design, the complexity of the game is not necessarily that relevant. Just like I said in Bomber Logs Down, that mini game, it genuinely doesn't. If I just want to progress the story with it and I want to create specific emotion, I don't need to create challenge out of it. I don't need to create challenge loop. I can just make you frustrated out of the bat. This also brings to specifics that making things for gamers, and not necessarily just for gamers. This one concerns players too, where games have been escapism for so long that power fantasy has permeated everything that we're doing. And power fantasy is not necessarily a good call for every game. For example, I don't want to give you power fantasy in a game where you're bombing people. I do not want to give you a power fantasy when you're a terrible British person on a date with a duck, because you're supposed to get shot. Apologies for spoilers. And if you're thinking about power fantasy, I do want you to consider that what power specifically is. Because domination and exploitation, those make sense. But control, cozy games are about control. You control your environment. It's still a power fantasy. You cannot remove power. You cannot make the player feel powerless, except for several examples like Doki Doki literature clubs. But again, these are exceptions that have not been replicated a lot. There's also knowledge. If you're making a mystery game or a puzzle game, the whole point and the power fantasy of it is that you feel smarter now. You understand more things. And of course, strength is the baseline, especially if you're like playing fighting games. But agency is also power fantasy. Again, is a continuation of control. And every narrative designer ever has heard about agency and how we should provide agency, and how a game with absolute agency is a holy grail. But does it need to exist if you just need to make a point, and you need to send a message, and you need to criticize something? In fact, I would say that agency creates more problems. For example, because of the agency, we are still making multiple endings. And I am using these two examples, but I am going to use them in a different perspective too. Because no one knows how to make good endings. I would argue that I would join myself in that list. I'm trying to figure that out with short games, but there is no incentive in this specific game design tradition to ever think about how to make good endings. Mass Effect and Deus Ex Human Revolution are like rare examples where we actually finish the game. And those are used as, again, something like narrative dissonance. Don't do it this way. And this is the only guideline that is interactive media specific. We can take something from movies, we can take something from books, literature, etc. But there is nothing that is our medium specific, except make it satisfying, reward the effort, and stuff like that. But these two are also irrelevant. We have been using those for a long, long time, but they're not bad. They had a backlash, and a massive backlash, and I understand why it happened to Mass Effect. There were promises made, there were original scripts leaked and have been scrapped. But for Deus Ex Human Revolution, this game is made very well. You don't actually have a choice at the end. You know what you're going to choose by the time that you reach to it, and you're just allowed to make a final statement yourself and be part of the message of the game. I would also say that with our metrics of like linearity and non-linearity, yeah, sure, these multiple endings make sense, but why do we keep putting them? In my practice, I separate interactivity and linearity into two different metrics, where linearity is exactly how many different endings, and I don't mean fail states, are there in the game, while interactivity is the amount of ways you can reach the end of the game, or those endings. And that metric is way more useful and has helped me out on multiple projects, including commercial ones, because it becomes easier to talk about. However, we don't, because there's no need for it. And again, the reason why I'm saying that like no one knows how to make good endings is mostly just because 20% of people finish games. They're long. And also once you reach the ending, you're way over refund time. So why would you bother? Why would you invest time in it? And endings, regardless if you know how to make them or not, are extremely hard to make. But we have never even invested in how to make them. I have been making games before going solo for 13, 10, 11, 12, doesn't matter how long. And that was the biggest problem for me. And it also ruined me in some ways. In Dark Date, sure, there are two endings, but none of them are particularly different. If anything, you just get an extra scene in between. But also, like, nobody would see that second scene because replayability is not encouraged in this game. The same way that Bomber looks down, because I added another ending, I don't know. I still cannot like find a proper reason why. I just added multiple endings because we do multiple endings, right? And so it has, because of how it was designed, it has ruined that one ending that everybody got to. The whole point of the game was to go underwater and say goodbye, blue sky, making a reference to Pink Floyd, where nobody has seen it. Specific line, because I did multiple endings. And this brings to basically one of like these all traditions separately. I hope that it tracks that basically if the moment we start unraveling the usual traditions, you're going to see how much they hamstring us from the narrative design perspective. And they all come from game design in some way and how we're making games. We're supposed to make them fun. So power fantasy is important. Power fantasy demands agency, and agency demands multiple endings, probably. And multiple endings do genuinely demand effort, reward. I mean, like I would genuinely say, if you are making a player play something for 50 hours, just suddenly ripping the carpet from underneath them is not a nice thing to do. Like, do reward them. But if you're making a short game, they have only wasted 1 hour. If it's free, I hope it's not free. Then, especially in this environment, then you can do different things and you can send a different message completely. And I have been hammering game design for a lot in this talk, but I want to specify that narrative design is not just hamstringed by the game design traditions, it's also hamstrung by our own traditions, to the point that a lot of things that we do in narrative design right now feels way more like rituals, not even traditions. We don't know why we do them. We just do them. It almost makes me feel like it's similar to like dancing a specific way or like doing or like putting on a specific clothes so that the rain comes down or you win in a sports game. Like out of these three dialogue systems, like you probably understand where they're used, but why are they used there and why they're used in this specific way? Why are there numbers for Baldur's Gate 3? And I mean, the answer should be because there is 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the keyboard, which are not used. So you can use the keyboard if you want to do it. Which also, if you ask that question and you figure it out, you will see that like doing Paratopic and Cyberpunk 2077 gameplay, if your game doesn't use specific buttons, you can just make that dialogue. Why is dialogue wheel still keep being used? Mass Effect, and do correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, Mass Effect was the first one to use dialogue wheel, which was later replicated in different ways, because I do believe that Electronic Arts have a patent on the dialogue wheel specifically. But Telltale and any like circular format is still being used. The reason for it is because somebody needed to figure out how to make dialogues for gamepad. Just simple as it is, and it works. But should it be used and in which specific genres and in which specific formats? In the same way, when I did for Bomber Looks Down, this specific way of dialogue writing, I struggled to make it work. Because like, this is nothing new. You would all recognize it if you ever played a visual novel made on Rampy, if you ever played a JRPG, if you ever played anything. A lot of the games that are just not using voiceover, this is just how it's using. But it is bad, objectively. I feel like it's objectively from a narrative design perspective, it's bad. Because you are basically just waiting for the text to type. And there is an argument about game juice. It's known more commonly as game feel. But you can do it a different way. You can do it like karaoke. I'm not going to use an example. I'm going to make you play a Hanar for it. That works way better. There is also the problem with like, in this specific game, there was a technical problem with how to use, because I had a limited map. And at some point, you will fly over the edge of the map. So I had to make sure, time-wise, that you are going to proceed to a different narrative. So I added the telltale thing that like was going to skip the text. No, not skip the text, but like move over to the next line of dialogue, which isn't a good thing to do normally, except this one is relatively generous. It allows you plenty of time to read and everything. But you are reading it only after it has played out. I would also add to these rituals that about like 8 years, I want to say, it has been over. But before that, at least in the Russian narrative design community, it was a guideline that any line of dialogue cannot be longer than 128 characters. Why? Because Twitter at the time was using 128 characters. They have later switched to 256 characters. Does this mean that you should make the line of dialogue different? Why was the original number used? And the original number was used because they were trying to imitate SMS or text messages, which were limited to 128. Now, 128, of course, has a very nice number. It is divisible. It is a square of, not square, but it's a power of 2. But also, this is just one of the executives or one of the tech departments, I want to say at Nokia, basically just found an average length of greeting cards. And so that was the reason why we used this length of the line. So why have we used this length of the line other than just somebody has told us so? This is absolutely irrelevant. This is absolutely doesn't work. And yet a lot of narrative design does feel like this. Because if we do it this way, it's almost like then the game won't sell by default. We did not perform the ritual. The rain of money just won't fall. And part of the reason, there are a lot of reasons for it, why we're still using those rituals. But also this means that innovation right now feels like heresy. It feels good, it is happening, but we are just dismissing it and not replicating it and not using it. Oxenfree is not the only game that is using interruption mechanic. And oh my god, every narrative designer who are missing like interactions are making the dialogue so much better. In fact, Christian Love has made a turn-based and visual novel like Interruption Mechanic 2. Both of them are glorious and make the dialogue so much better by introducing interruptions. My favorite concept in narrative design ever is Thought Cabinet. It was used once, and partly because the game director Robert Kurbitz himself said that this mechanic almost ruined the game and almost buried it. But it is an amazing mechanic, and nothing is stopping us from, except for the fact that it's unreliable and it is heresy. And if we make it, it doesn't mean that the game is going to be better, but it will. The narrative is going to be absolutely better. So maybe we should try investing a bit more. However, we didn't because it is heresy. Deviation feels like sin. Failure is sin. Because if you make it like if narrative somehow makes it unpalatable or unplayable for, well, I'm going to say gamers, but also like other people, and we don't know how to make sure that like the mechanic itself of which we have to experiment is going to work, or the genre bending is going to work. I am using here example of Ixion specifically. Ixion is the usual city builder game made on this specific space base where you're supposed to be a colony ship. Something goes wrong, and the most of the game, everything is on fire. Moreover, the game is apologies. The game is moving itself along with limited input from the player. Well, not sorry. The story progresses at certain intervals. This is not a limited input from the player. It's just that like there are specific events for it. But this also for a person like me who is basically playing those games just to see numbers offload their brain and not think about anything, not feel anything. I had a long day, blah blah blah. Ixion has made me genuinely care for numbers. And these numbers were colonists that are in cryopod in certain areas. And because of the game structure, if I don't collect them, then they're going to disappear forever. And that has superseded, because of the narrative and because of the whole setup, the fact that the colonists can also be are also like the thing that not colony, people basically. They're not like colonists because you're taking it from another ship. It supersedes, but these little cryopods, thinking about them as people supersedes the fact that they are also just a number to fill your factories and everything. And Ixion was not critically received, not well received by players, because this is not what expected from City Builder. This was a deviation. This was a narrative deviation specifically. But, and this is the problem, sin is a waste of money. Why would you invest in a dialogue mechanic if you don't know that it is going to sell? Sin doesn't sell. Narrative design just doesn't sell. And we as narrative designers do not invest in it. There is no reason for it. Because if we do these things, we might just become unemployable in some ways. If, for example, if you have made political games and a lot of political games, then would it be a problem to employ you? Would you, if you're an employer and you are telling like our games are not political, would hiring somebody who has made political games would be a problem? Also, will this make you just a conflict person? Because you understand that like something is unethical and you have been doing it, you would be suggesting weird concepts, while for some games it's just narrative is just a tradition. Narrative just needs to be in a game. And I want to leave you on a little bit of an uplifting note and potentially further reading and everything, because fear of losing your job is one of the big problems in video games. Because where else would you find for work? Narrative design is exclusively video game, is exclusively video game term. It's not an exclusively video game application. I didn't mention it here, which is a crime, but interactive fiction is basically narrative design in a pure way. But it's almost like it's a separate industry if you are thinking about it from the perspective of the traditional video games. LARP is excellent for narrative design. They do not have the term narrative design. There is no necessity for it. A game designer there basically is using the craft of narrative design. And because of that, there are terms that doesn't exist in video games that we could absolutely use and think about. For example, player alibi. It is amazing. Player alibi is basically a concept of how to, if you have a player who is supposed to play a role of a bad person, how do you provide them with an alibi so that they are free and comfortable to play it? With consent, obviously. Educational games and educational interactives, they are an absolute treasure trove of UX because they're not supposed to be made for gamers. They're supposed to be the precise point is that they remove as many as possible obstacles between the player and understanding what to do. TTRPGs, like basically in TTRPGs, everybody is a game designer, but I would argue that of all of them, these game designers are supposed to be called narrative designers. And I'm not saying that we should call people different ways, but it's a discipline of narrative design specifically. Of course, like I can just start by like the usual adage that the best way to learn narrative design is to run a tabletop campaign. Also in TTRPG genre, and this is the claim why I'm saying it's mostly narrative design, because they're not selling fun, they're selling the experience and the emotion of playing some role. I do recommend you checking out Ludo Arson, specifically by Piers Birch, where Piers Birch worked a lot of research on, for example, Doom games, where the end of the game is the end of the world. There is ending, there is no agency, it's gonna end. What do you do? And out of every other adjacent medium, performance art is probably the most close to us. But of course, like it feels way more different, especially if you're talking about art. Suddenly, it becomes way more important because the intake concept, for example, that exists in performance art, would be used in video games a lot because you enter the room, you see the computer. How do you make a player more engaged with the computer? The same way that you're entering the room and there is a performance. There are naked people lying on the floor. What's the point of it? How do you interact with it? How are you allowed to be able to interact with it? And there are so on and so on more examples. Narrative design is just craft. Narrative design is a set of tools. Narrative design is a way to approaching the end goal that you can use for everything, including, for example, giving a talk. You have to address the information. You have to address how people are interacting with it. In this specific situation, nobody's interacting with me. Well, while I'm giving the talk, there is a chat that I can just ignore while I'm doing the talk. But if I'm doing this in person, somebody can just yell that I'm an asshole and I have to deal with it. Or I can pay somebody to yell asshole every 5 minutes or so. And then it becomes, again, part of narrative design. You can apply it absolutely everywhere, just because video games industry is not the only video games industry. And so bringing it all back here, this is the reason why I wanted to give this talk is to remove from you this block that to criticize X, you have to make X fun. And instead, to criticize X, you have to abandon these game dev traditions because they are not applicable for criticizing anything. These game dev traditions are specifically designed for games to be sold, for games to be fun, for games to be made for gamers. And if you have to make art, it's not fun. And this is the last slide. This is the end of my presentation. I believe we have 5 more minutes, if I'm correct. I do see the chat. So if you have any questions, do fire them over. Oh, yeah, Jordan said that I have 3 minutes left, not 5. I mean, I don't know necessarily how the delay works for the Twitch, because I'm obviously real time. Should you wait for the delay or? And maybe if somebody's thinking, oh, if we are to finish the air, I would say as like the end of it, of like to cap it, or like it was an extremely little I'm hoping that for a lot of you, like what I have said is obvious, because it wasn't for me being so ingrained in like the video game industry, and in the same way that like when I'm teaching students, and a lot of them are coming over basically like, yeah, just working in games industry and that's it. But once I realized that I have other options and I can make games different ways, that not only have like changed my design practice, it also like removed a lot of fear and precariousness from me. Even though like I'm not necessarily successful at selling games, it's the way of making it, and like the life work balance is just has absolutely changed. And I would like probably, if I have time to spare, I would add that like I recommend you, apart from checking out the briefs themselves, apart from checking out my games, I would recommend checking out also Alexandra Jarosz. This is the Fantastic Annihilation and Fantastic Fetus. Obviously Natalie Lawhead. The Game by Angela Vashko, and the works of Angela Vashko in general. Cannibal Interactive, Damien Crawford specifically, for games that are just made with the goal to spite, which is a very interesting way to make video games. Obviously, 30 Flights of Love and Blender Games, and other solo game developers. General reading on it, like again, P.S. Burge is a wonderful avenue for it. My own Absurd Games has a lot of other links, and yeah, and I just recommend to everybody, especially if you haven't ever done a game jam, just try to make a shitpost game. This is an absolutely phenomenal experience of just making a game that will never sell, doesn't sell, and you have no idea if it ever will sell or not. And I believe this would be my time. I've been Evgeni Puzankov. You can find me at all_worms. And thank you very much for the Super Festival for having me. Bye.
Let's just go for a mullet. You know, and that looks great, honestly. Good job. You look great. Next. Okay, we got some of these. What the hell does this do? Oh, okay, curls it. Well, that's great. We got one of these guys that just kind of blows it around, I guess. All right. Oh, goodbye. What am I supposed to do with this? Okay, we're gonna have to probably just clean some of this up. Honestly, not sure if we're gonna get that fixed. Probably best to just cut off a bunch of it, I think. Oh god, the hair is getting everywhere. It's all over my shop. Ugh. Okay, well, let's shave you kind of just on one side and, yeah, just everywhere. Okay, get out of here. Really gotta figure out how to turn these off. Ultra clutch hair cement. Okay, here you are. Let's curl left side, some colors. Good enough. Next! What's it gonna be this time? You have too much hair. We can...
Wait, you know what I want to do?
What?
What do you think it would be about? For if they made our lives a movie, it would be boring.
刺虎武汉火车票一张。
我要去武汉，我他妈也得先把你带了。
武汉只让进不让出，现在。
武汉不是
不进也不能进了，你们俩真往这边。浪呢？浪呢？
Hello, how are you? Hey, it's you. I'm saying hi to you. Can you see me? I'm over here, on the left side of the screen. Oh, you want to interview me? Okay. Well, my daily job is just waiting here. Boring? Maybe a little bit. Oh, what, my dream? To go to Coney Island. I wanted to go to the beach, enjoy my vacation life. I've always wanted to know what swimming feels like. It must be different from getting drenched in the rain, right? But I know I can never get there. I'm just a trash can. I think I might spend my whole life here on 363 Lafayette Street. Huh? Is this a balloon? How did you know that yellow is my favorite color? Thank you. Hey, come back. Wait, I'm not done yet. Wait, come back. Wait a second. I feel something different. I feel like my body's getting lighter. Wait, am I finally going to Coney Island?
Phew, what an amazing day of talks. Thanks to all the speakers, exhibitors, and everyone who tuned in to watch. I hope you got interested in more games and learned something along the way. But Super Festival is not done yet. We're here all 7 days from November 25th to December 1st, and there's still plenty more festival to go. Be sure to check out our special Super Festival website for more information about the exhibited games, our speakers, our stream schedule, our upcoming online workshops, and more. Also, if you're in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, be sure to see our map to check out the Tron arcade machines throughout the city. And join us this Saturday at the Hand-Eye Society Ball. Once again, a huge shout out to our amazing sponsors. Thank you to Ontario Creates, the City of Toronto, the Province of Ontario, the Toronto Arts Council, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Canada Council for the Arts, as well as our studio sponsors Clever Endeavor and Stella Maris. Well, that's all for today. We'll be back tomorrow with more talks and games. Thank you for watching, everyone, and I'll see you tomorrow.